Gunshots cut through the night, shells falling on cracked pavement, and a small body laid still while neighbors screamed. The killer sped off into the dark, leaving nothing but chaos and the sound of crying mothers. Folks crowded around, shocked at how young the victim was, whispering that this wasn't no OG. The streets knew him though, because he carried a reputation bigger than his age ever suggested. This was a kid who walked into a war zone every single day, holding a name that carried weight across South Central. The question is simple but heavy. How did a 12-year-old child end up in one of Los Angeles' deadliest gang wars? Back in the early 1990s, South Central Los Angeles felt less like a neighborhood and more like a battlefield where every block carried its own story of bloodshed. The numbers told it straight because by 1994, gang murders made up about 43% of all homicides across Los Angeles County, and that meant almost every other killing tied back to Crips, Bloods, or their offshoots. The year 1994 alone saw 779 lives lost to gang-related violence, making it one of the deadliest stretches in Los Angeles history. Kids growing up in South Central weren't shielded from the war because even children caught stray bullets while playing on sidewalks or walking to school. The Los Angeles Times reported that since 1987, at least 28 children under the age of 10 had been killed by gang members across the county. The median age of victims sat at just 21, proving that gang life was dragging in younger and younger generations. Families tried to keep their kids safe, but broken schools, heavy unemployment, and fractured homes made survival more about affiliation than education. Eric Decatur was born right into that storm in July 1982, when the Hoover criminals already carried a reputation as one of the most feared sets in Los Angeles. Their history stretched back to Hoover Street, where the original Hoover Groovers started out before becoming Crips in the 1970s. By the mid-80s, the Hoovers had already built a name for brutal gun violence, and by the 1990s, their turf around 83rd and Hoover ranked as one of the most dangerous places in Los Angeles. South Central in those days wasn't just Crips versus Bloods, because the alliances inside the Crip umbrella started breaking apart. Sets divided between gangster Crips or Trays and neighborhood Crips or Deuces, which made old allies into bitter enemies. The Hoovers had long stood under the gangster Crip card, but by the mid-90s they renounced the Crip identity completely, calling themselves Hoover Criminals to mark their independence. Their slogan, "Everybody Killer," wasn't just words, it was a warning that Hoovers saw no friends in every set as opposition. One of the ugliest fallouts was with the 8-Trade Gangster Crips, a set whose names sounded almost identical but had split away from the Hoovers despite sharing 83 in their turf title. What started as loose ties among gangster Crips ended in all-out war by 1995, when the 8-Trays and Hoovers went from neighbors to sworn enemies. That feud lit up the streets with constant drive-bys, gun battles, and retaliation after retaliation. By the time Lil Chipmunk started roaming the block, South Central was already soaked in that energy. Kids like him didn't have to look far to see guns, graffiti, and fresh memorial candles on every corner. For someone born and raised in the shady 8s, that was the only world he knew. Eric Decatur came into this world on July 27, 1982, right in Los Angeles. He was born into South Central, a place already deep inside heavy gang politics. His mother tried raising him the best she could, but the streets were loud around him. Eric went to Manchester Elementary School, sitting in classrooms where his teachers noticed his bright mind. He was remembered as creative, sharp with numbers, and gifted with unusual intelligence for his young age. Some classmates remembered him as funny, energetic, and quick to speak his thoughts openly. Even with potential, home life wasn't steady, because his father was mostly absent and never consistent. Without a real father figure guiding him, the void around Eric grew deeper every year. His mother could provide shelter and food, but she couldn't fill the missing space. The neighborhood didn't give kids much protection, and that became Eric's biggest reality very early. Shootouts cracked the air outside, and sirens screamed through the night on Hoover Street.
They're amateurs. They're just shooting to kill whoever they want to get.
Kids walking to school often saw bodies covered with sheets on the sidewalk. By the time Eric was old enough to ride his bike, 83 Hoover was already his environment. The Hoovers controlled those blocks, and every corner carried their presence with graffiti, hand signs, and lookouts. A young boy could walk outside and see older homies hustling dope and carrying pistols. Inside those streets, admiration didn't go to school teachers, but to shooters and hustlers keeping the block hot. Boys saw killers treated like legends, and that shaped what kids wanted to be. For many, being in a gang wasn't rebellion, it was survival and belonging. Eric grew up in what the locals called the Shady Eights, a part of Hoover territory. That area had rundown houses, abandoned lots, and constant police helicopters shining lights on rooftops. When people described that side of town, they always called it raw and dangerous. As he grew older, the sounds of gunfire and constant funerals became regular parts of life. Family structure in South Central often cracked, and young boys leaned toward crews for guidance. The Hoovers offered protection, identity, and status, which pulled kids like Eric in. By the late 80s and early 90s, Eric was surrounded by an atmosphere where gangs recruited young. Some kids joined for adventure, some for protection, and some just followed their brothers. For Eric, the environment offered belonging that school or home couldn't fully give. His early years laid the foundation, and by his preteens, the streets had already claimed him. The boy once praised for math skills now carried curiosity for what hustlers were doing outside. Manchester Elementary might have seen promise, but Hoover Street showed him something louder. By the time Eric was around 11, he had stepped fully into the gang world. That was when his street name was given, the one everyone later remembered. They called him Lil Chipmunk, and the nickname stuck heavy across South Central. The name came without a big homie attachment, which was unusual inside that culture. He wasn't carrying someone else's name because he carved respect on his own. People speculated it came from his small stature or a voice that carried youth. On forums years later, locals confirmed the story, saying they remembered the day he got that name. Unlike other kids who took Lil after an older gangster, Chipmunk was independent. That made his identity different because even the older Hoover members respected his presence. Eric quickly made noise for being active, and he wasn't playing childish games anymore. At just 11, he was already stealing cars and teaching peers how to hotwire. One person wrote online that Chipmunk taught him car theft when they were both 11. Car theft was a common entry point in Los Angeles gangs, and Chipmunk excelled at it. He learned how to strip stolen vehicles for parts or provide rides for missions. For such a young age, this skill made him valuable to his homies. The boy also carried heat, specifically a .38 revolver, according to accounts from locals. That weapon gave him confidence, and he wasn't shy about pulling it during confrontations. Older dudes noticed his boldness because most kids that age weren't gripping steel like that. His reputation spread fast, and people started describing him as a little dude with a big gun. Even rivals admitted that he wasn't scared to press anyone walking near Hoover territory. Some older teenagers were bothered daily by this kid standing on the corner. One famous account came from Bosco 100, the rapper who grew up near those blocks. He said Chipmunk pressed him regularly when they were kids, almost every day.
Yeah, Lil Chipmunk, that was the first person to terrorize me.
Bosco recalled the boy demanding he represent Hoover, even though he wasn't from the set. Eventually, Bosco fought back, and he said they scrapped one-on-one in the street. The crazy part was that Bosco was older, but he still remembered the fight vividly. That was how Chipmunk earned a reputation far beyond just his neighborhood. Even though he was still a child, people began treating him like a real frontliner. He stood outside with older homies, carrying himself with a fearlessness that shocked everyone. His small frame didn't stop him from pressing rivals or even older kids. By the summer of 1995, the name Lil Chipmunk had spread across South Central, whispered with respect. He was only 12, but he was already a figure other kids feared crossing paths with. The Hoover streets had turned him from a gifted student into a frontline soldier. Being called a frontliner in Los Angeles gangs meant something heavy and serious. It wasn't a nickname for decoration. It was a label given to the ones who stood first. A frontliner was the kid or man who carried the strap and pressed the issue. When enemies drove through or challenged the block, the frontliner stepped forward first. For juveniles, that role was common because the courts were soft on young offenders. Cops and judges knew kids couldn't face adult sentences at 12 or 13. That loophole made them valuable soldiers for sets like the Hoovers.
And because they're juveniles, they know they can get away with it, so...
They were expected to carry guns, do robberies, and take the heat if arrested. Eric Lil Chipmunk Decatur became one of those soldiers before his 13th birthday. His small size didn't stop older homies from putting him on dangerous moves. The block already knew he could hotwire cars and ride with shooters. That skill alone made him more useful than some older teenagers. Accounts say Chipmunk was quick to intimidate people who didn't belong on Hoover territory. Rival gang members, random outsiders, and even neighborhood kids got pressed by this little figure. He wasn't asking politely either, he was checking papers with aggression. Rumors floated around that he pulled the trigger on rivals during neighborhood conflicts. No official court documents survived because juvenile records were sealed and witnesses stayed quiet. Still, street stories repeated his name whenever shootings between Hoovers and rivals were mentioned. Bosco 100 already told the story of being pressed daily by the boy. Imagine a teenage blood feeling, stalked by a 12-year-old Hoover. That situation alone shows how strong Chipmunk's reputation grew beyond his block. Other locals remembered him carrying that .38 revolver tucked in his waistband. People described how he pulled it out without hesitation when situations heated up. For many, seeing a child gripping steel that heavy was haunting. Older gang members respected his energy, but also knew the streets were chewing him alive. To them, he was brave but reckless, and they saw how short lives ended. They probably recognized how dangerous it was for a 12-year-old to be that visible. What made the image even harder to swallow was his face. Circulating online today is a blurry photo showing a baby-faced boy flashing Hoover hand signs. His smile looks almost innocent, but the gesture speaks to gang identity. That contrast between childlike appearance and street allegiance captured the tragedy. People who look at that photo now shake their heads in disbelief. They say he was just a kid, still with soft cheeks and a Disney smile. But that same kid already lived as a frontliner carrying guns and stealing cars. The Hoovers didn't treat him like a mascot, they treated him like one of them. He wasn't protected from danger because his age made him more expendable. For rivals, he was already considered a target like any other shooter. By the summer of 1995, Chipmunk wasn't just another Hoover recruit. His name carried weight on the block, and enemies recognized him too. To the neighborhood, he represented the new generation of soldiers, young and fearless. To outsiders, he was proof of how deep the cycle of violence reached into childhood. The streets weren't the only ones watching Lil Chipmunk because the cops had their eyes too. During the mid-1990s, the LAPD ran a show called Life on the Beat. That program showed officers patrolling South Central and dealing with suspects in real time. And in one episode, the cameras captured a moment that later became legendary. Officers stopped two young boys in Hoover territory, and one of them was Eric Decatur. Viewers were stunned when the small boy identified himself as Chip.
What do they call you, young man? What do they call you?
Chip.
The dialogue from that night remains chilling for anyone who hears it today. An officer asked him directly, "Been smoking the chronic?" Eric answered flatly with a simple no.
Been smoking the chronic?
Nah.
That exchange highlighted how familiar police already were with kids and gangs. The officer pressed further, asking, "You got any tattoos, Chip?" Eric replied matter of fact, "Yup."
You got any tattoos, Chip?
Yep.
For a 12-year-old, admitting to gang tattoos was shocking. Tattoos inside Hoover sets often showed the letter H or the number 83. Some carried EBK ink to represent the slogan, "Everybody Killer." That tattoo confirmed for police that this little boy was already marked for the streets. Once a kid carried ink, the identity became permanent and difficult to escape. Officers on the scene seemed both amazed and disturbed by what they witnessed. As the cameras rolled, one officer muttered lines that stuck with viewers. He said, "What is all of this for? That ain't right."
What is all of this for?
We're just checking you out, man.
That ain't right.
His words sounded less like interrogation and more like disbelief at the situation. Another officer mentioned mother, likely preparing to contact Eric's mom about her son's arrest. Behind the street name Chipmunk, there was still someone's child being processed. His mother had to face the truth that her boy was already identified as a gangbanger. After the arrest, both boys were taken to Los Padrinos Juvenile Hall in Downey. That facility held serious juvenile offenders across Los Angeles County. For Chipmunk, it was his first major encounter with detention. He didn't stay there long because the system couldn't hold a 12-year-old for months. Juveniles often face probation or short stays unless charged with major violent crimes. Records show he was released within weeks, free to return to Hoover Street. The timing was eerie because less than a month after his release, he was dead. That quick turnaround revealed how ineffective the system was at saving kids like him. He slipped back through the cracks and walked straight into danger again. The episode footage later circulated online, serving as haunting evidence of his short path. People who saw it couldn't believe how calm he looked being questioned by police. It wasn't a nervous child being stopped. It was a gang member already hardened. That television moment cemented his identity in history because it showed both sides. On one hand, it was a baby-faced 12-year-old standing under flashing police lights. On the other, it was a soldier already branded with tattoos and carrying Hoover's name. Cops had him in custody, but the streets had him in spirit. The system never managed to pull him out long enough to change his course. When he walked out of Los Padrinos, the countdown to tragedy was already ticking. By the summer of 1995, South Central was drowning in nonstop gunfire and retaliation. The Hoover criminals were locked in brutal battles with the 8-tray gangster Crips. That war turned blocks into battlegrounds where every day brought another shooting or another chase. People in the neighborhood said you could barely walk 2 blocks without hearing gunshots. Sirens echoed every night, helicopters hovered overhead, and funerals filled calendars week after week. The feud wasn't just words and graffiti, it was daily violence fought at close range. The Hoovers had already declared themselves independent by dropping the Crip label officially. Their slogan, "Everybody Killer," spread like wildfire, making every gang a potential enemy. The 8-trays took the conflict personally since they once stood beside the Hoovers. When those ties broke, it cut deeper than any usual rivalry across South Central. Friends became enemies overnight and neighbors became shooters looking for revenge. The Hoover territory around 83rd Street carried heavy tension and the community felt trapped. Eric, Lil Chipmunk Decatur walked back into that storm straight from Los Padrinos Juvenile Hall. He had just turned 13 in late July after serving a short detention. Instead of a fresh start, he returned home to a block hotter than ever. People noticed that even after Juvenile Hall, he stepped right back into the same lane. There was no break in his energy, no hesitation about showing his allegiance. He wore Hoover colors, flashed signs, and stood outside with the same older soldiers. Tensions by August were already sky high because every corner felt unsafe and unpredictable. Hoovers and 8-trays were hunting each other relentlessly, trading drive-bys almost daily across South Central. Everyone on the block was armed, and paranoia ran deep through the neighborhood. For rivals, Chipmunk was already seen as a figure carrying real danger. His reputation as a kid with a gun made older enemies cautious. Some even believed he had already participated in shootings despite his young age. Street rumors circulated that the 8-trays wanted him gone as much as any adult. Even if he wasn't the biggest threat, his rising name made him symbolic. Killing him would send a message to the Hoovers that no one was untouchable. Neighbors recalled how strange it felt to see a child carrying himself like a soldier. His presence didn't bring safety, it brought more danger because rivals wanted him too. By August 1995, he was living under constant risk from both streets and rivals. That summer became his deadliest season because every day carried the weight of open warfare. The Hoover corridors were filled with tension, and Chipmunk was stuck right in the center. He had lived only 13 years, but his life already felt hunted. On the night of August 25th, 1995, the streets finally caught up with him. Accounts differ slightly, but everyone agrees he was out near 83rd and Hoover. Some say he was riding his bike down the block, others say he was walking. The tension of that summer had already primed the area for another shooting. A car rolled slowly through the neighborhood, and inside were armed rivals from the 8-trays. Without warning, gunfire ripped out of the windows, spraying bullets across the street. Eric Lil Chipmunk Decatur was hit multiple times, his young body falling onto the pavement instantly. Neighbors rushed out as the car sped away, leaving nothing but chaos behind. People screamed, some cried, and others stood frozen, seeing a child bleeding out. Paramedics were called quickly, but the injuries were already too severe to survive. Some said he died right there on the sidewalk before help arrived. Others believed he was taken into an ambulance but passed away en route. Either way, he didn't make it. The image of that small body stretched across the ground stuck heavy with the neighborhood. This wasn't an older gangbanger with years of war behind him. It was a boy barely 13 years old who had already been feared. Neighbors later said the horror wasn't just the death itself, but his age. They knew he had carried a gun, but seeing him lifeless broke hearts. Mothers pulled their kids inside that night, realizing children weren't safe on either side. His death was part of a bloody summer that left many young lives destroyed. Official news reports were scarce because juvenile deaths often went unnoticed outside local circles. But on Hoover Street, his name was etched into memory as another soldier lost. People quickly compared his killing to another child who died just a year earlier. Robert Yummy Sandifer, an 11-year-old gang member from Chicago, was killed in 1994. His story made national headlines after Time magazine featured his face on the cover. The similarities were impossible to ignore because both boys were children turned into frontliners. Yummy died after committing shootings for the Black Disciples in Chicago, killed by his own gang. Chipmunk died on Los Angeles streets during a feud that didn't spare anyone. Unlike Yummy, Chipmunk's death never hit national papers, but in South Central it echoed hard. People whispered his name, wrote tributes on walls, and told stories of his short life. Some saw him as a cautionary tale, others remembered him as a little legend. On August the 25th, 1995, South Central lost another young soldier to bullets. The war didn't stop, and his death blended into the cycle of constant revenge. For his family, it was devastating, and for the neighborhood, it was one more scar. When word spread that Lil Chipmunk was gone, the neighborhood reacted with heavy silence. By that summer, people had already grown numb from constant funerals and shootings across South Central. Another body on the pavement barely shocked them anymore, but the age cut deeper. Mothers who lived near Hoover Street whispered that they had warned their children repeatedly. They told them to stay inside, avoid corners, and never walk alone after dark. The killing of a 13-year-old made those warnings feel sharper than ever. The Hoover set handled death with memorials, rituals, and retaliations, because that was the cycle. Graffiti appeared on walls in the territory with messages like "Hip Chipmunk." That stood for Hoover in Peace, a way to remember fallen members across the set. Some neighbors said they saw candles burning at corners where people gathered in silence. Older Hoovers wore his name proudly when speaking about him during late-night conversations. Even rivals admitted that hearing about a 12-year-old soldier shook them. Retaliation didn't take long because the feud with the 8 Trays was still raging. Any Hoover loss was usually followed by another round of drive-bys and shootings. People didn't track which death avenged which, because the cycle spun endlessly across neighborhoods. For Eric's family, the pain was more than just another number in statistics. His mother had already seen officers question him on camera weeks before his death. Now she faced the unimaginable task of burying her child while remembering his playful years. Accounts later revealed that his sisters were pulled into the same gang culture. They lived through the same Hoover territory, carrying the same dangers and facing similar risks. His story didn't end with his death because his family stayed tied to that life. In the bigger picture, his death was part of one of Los Angeles' bloodiest years. Nearly 800 gang-related homicides were counted across the county in 1995 alone. Eric's name didn't headline newspapers, but his loss was part of that grim total. Inside the Hoover corridors, the whispers about Chipmunk never disappeared. People told younger recruits about the little soldier who pressed rivals before he was a teenager. His memory turned into a mix of cautionary story and street folklore that lasted decades. Decades later, his name resurfaced through YouTube documentaries, Instagram archives, and gang history forums. Viewers were shocked to learn that a 12-year-old once carried guns in South Central. His story attracted hundreds of thousands of views, keeping his memory alive online. Tributes often carried captions like "never glorifying, just reminiscing," trying to balance memory with responsibility. People in the comments argued about whether he was a legend or just a tragedy. Some said he proved how fearless Hoovers were, while others mourned wasted childhood. The justice system's failure echoed through every retelling of his story. People pointed out that police once had him in custody briefly. The courts released him quickly, and within weeks, he was lying dead on Hoover Street. His life highlighted the reality of the 1990s gang epidemic, where children got recruited young. Whole generations of boys were groomed into pulling triggers before they reached high school. Communities buried kids who should have been playing ball or chasing school grades. Eric Lil Chipmunk Decatur stood as both feared and forgotten in Los Angeles history. His story reminded everyone how fast childhood could vanish in the streets. When people looked at his photo, they saw innocence destroyed too soon by the cycle. Eric Lil Chipmunk Decatur's story didn't need exaggeration because the facts already spoke volumes. He was a boy barely 13 who became a frontliner in one of Los Angeles' deadliest summers. His name lived on in graffiti, whispered stories, and online documentaries that kept his memory alive. To some, he was a fearless soldier who stood tall too young. To others, he was a symbol of how badly the system failed children in South Central. When people remember him now, they don't just see a Hoover soldier, they see a child who carried a gun before carrying a diploma. His short life remains a reminder of what happens when the streets raise a boy faster than his years.